Welcome to the cross in the desert, speaking hope and freedom to Iran. I'm your host, Randy L. Noble. So very glad that you could join me on this very special program. Survivors of the Revolution, 35 years later. And of course, I'm speaking of the February 1st, 1979 entrance of Khomeini into Iran, and thus the official start of the Iranian Revolution, and the day my Iranian friends' lives were changed forever. What I want to do on this very special broadcast tonight is to pay tribute to a very courageous friend of mine, and I'm going to show you her pictures. She's a human rights activist living in Ottawa, Canada, and I want you to take a look at her. Her name is Shabnam Story, and I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. But Shabnam is a very courageous human rights activist that grew up and experienced the Iranian Revolution. We're going to show you some pictures of her tonight. This is another picture of Shabnam receiving an award here from some members of Parliament, I believe, concerning International Women's Day a couple of years ago. Another picture of Shabnam, and this is her at an event speaking and doing what she does best, speaking out for human rights for everyone around the world, but in particular those that live in Iran. The reason I want to spend some time talking about my friend Shabnam is because she is courageous. She spends an awful lot of time on her Facebook page exposing the horrible treatment of Iranians by the oppressive dictatorship of the Iranian regime in Iran. A lot of her posts is exposing and educating us about what happens in Iran. So many people all over the world are not aware of how Iranians are treated on a daily basis, how their lives are spent in oppression and fear. And thanks to Shabnams Story, she makes the internet come alive with a real education about what Iranians experience on a daily basis, as well as exposing the brutal way the regime violates the human rights of those living in Iran. I want to read to you something very special, and this is from a man named Royal Galipo from Ottawa, Orleans, Ontario, and I believe he's speaking in behalf of Parliament on International Women's Day, and this is something he said in regards to my friend Shabnam. Mr. Speaker, yesterday was the 101st International Women's Day. I would like to take the opportunity to pay tribute to one of the most courageous women I know, Shabnams Story. Iranian by birth and Canadian by choice, she has worked for decades to promote human rights. A seasoned advocate, Ms. Story founded a number of multicultural programs to help newcomers, particularly women, adjust to their new country, referring to those coming to Canada. This remarkable woman, who lives in Orleans, has had 8 children's books translated into Farsi and distributed them in Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. Through her compassion and understanding of the reality facing newcomers, this exceptional woman is such an asset to our great country. I would like to thank Shabnam for her dedication to these worthy causes. Shabash to you and to all those who use wisdom and knowledge to promote human rights. And I echo that with an amen. Shabnams Story, under horrific circumstances, survived the notorious Evin prison in Iran at the age of 16. Overcoming fear and impossible odds, Shabnam tells how she was brought to a pivotal place in her life where she found purpose and broke out of the darkness. Her story is one of honesty and passion for her faith. Shabnam is a veteran human rights advocate and has worked extensively helping newcomers and refugees, particularly women, resettle in Canada. She has been engaged in radio broadcasting since 1992 and involved in missionary work with Transworld Radio Canada, producing over 200 child and youth programs. An amazing lady, but back in 1979, and in just a week, we are going to look back at what was the most life-transforming event in the world and in Iran. And what I'm referring to, of course, is the Iranian Revolution of 1979, how it forever changed my friends who live in Iran. And tonight we're highlighting one of those, Shabnam, who is a survivor of the revolution 35 years later. Let's look just briefly at some photographs of this pivotal event. And this, of course, is a very famous photograph of those on the tanks causing fear and panic in the streets. And on that day, this was a scene no more. Look very carefully. These are women at Tehran University back in 1977. That was the way they dressed. But look at this. And that is the same women carrying banners, posters, singing praises to Khomeini. And look at the way they're dressed now in dark clothing, hijabs, chadors. No longer the miniskirts, the jeans, the things that women enjoyed wearing. 1979 also put an end to human freedom and human free speech in Iran. I want you to look at this scene. This goes on yet today in Iran. If you disagree with the regime, if you disagreed with Khomeini, this is what happened to you. You were hung. No questions asked. Another photograph I want you to look at carefully. This is Evin prison, where my dear friend Saeed Abedini is now a prisoner. But this is also the prison that our friend Shabnam spent 18 months in. What I want to do right now on our program is I want to talk about Shabnams Story. This is an incredible story of courage and faith. And I want to read to you the first paragraph of her story because it sets the stage for what was to happen next. Shabnam writes, I was just 13 when Khomeini came into power. By hijacking the People's Revolution and overnight all women, including elementary school girls, were forced to cover their bodies from head to toe and were ordered to wear only dark colors. We were no longer allowed to attend school with the opposite sex. Our once praised school curriculum was now replaced by Arabic, Islamic studies, and the Quran, which most of us simply loathed. It was at this time that I had an awakening and I started my activism. I was robbed of my teen years by a radical regime that sought to force its values on the masses by devastating force. My childhood memories were replaced by a reality created by a regime where women were now treated as second-class citizens to men, and even the most mundane details of our lives was strictly controlled by Khomeini's Revolutionary Guards and morality police. Can you imagine a teenager whose life is turned absolutely upside down by a man who came into Iran saying, I'm going to come and bring democracy and freedom, but it was all a lie. It was all a bribe. He had the hearts and minds of souls of so many Iranians on his side, and those that dared to question allegiance to him ended up like Shabnam. Well, Shabnam, when she looked at her life and how it was being changed and how the classrooms now were making it mandatory to learn Islamic thought and the Quran, as she has told me on my Crossing the Desert program when she was a guest, I'm very outspoken and opinionated. And so Shabnam could not keep her voice to herself. She had to speak out. She had to say, this is wrong. This is something fundamentally wrong. How dare you come in and change everyone's life like that? And of course, eventually, her activism, her outspokenness caught up with her. And one day, in her peaceful home, with her mom as a witness, 4 big heavy-set men from the Revolutionary Guard marched into her home at 16 years of age and carted her away to the infamous hellhole known as Evin Prison. Can you imagine watching your 16-year-old daughter being arrested by 5 very large, heavy-set guards? And she barely weighed 90 pounds at the time, Shabnam says. Just imagine the terror and anguish of a young girl. And here's a quote that Shabnam made that I think is very instrumental for all of us who live in the West who don't understand what it's like to live in Iran, even today, with the dictatorship regime. Shabnam says, I did not think that a simple conversation, having an opinion, and simply expressing it would put my very life in danger. And yet, that opinion, that outspokenness was not tolerated by this regime who expected absolute 100% loyalty. When she was took to Evin prison, there was a man there known as the Rapist of Iran. In there, they brought prisoners in. They blindfolded them, interrogated them day and night, tortured them day and night. Even young 12-year-old children were put before the firing squad and executed by this madman Khomeini. Ironically, and I believe the providence of God stepped in and spared Shabnam. Her very interrogator, labeled as the Rapist of Iran, spared her life, would set her outside of the torture chamber, day and night blindfolded where she was hungry and sometimes sick, but spared her of this horrible agony which most everyone in her situation had to go through. It amazed Shabnam, the way that she had spoken out against the Islamic Republic, that she was spared. And she recalls noticing that at night she heard sometimes 60 and 70 bullet shots. She counted them and knew that those bullet shots were making targets out of those that disagreed. That meant 70 executions. Can you imagine in a prison where torture sometimes is not the worst thing, but the psychological terror of hearing people scream and cry to die because of the agony of being there? And Shabnam, when she heard those gunshots, I'm certainly sure it terrified her. She thought, I could be next. Can you imagine at 16 being in her situation? But miraculously, her stay in Evin prison was 18 months. And she recalls these horrible experiences at night. And at night, she remembers making a deal with God, saying, look, don't spare my life, but spare my parents the agony of having to go through my death. And if you'll do that, I will speak out for you the rest of my life. I will speak out against the atrocities and the human rights violations of this Iranian regime. I will not be silent. And you know what? God honored this simple plea from this 16-year-old girl, because that's what Shabnam does today. She remembers doing this. She remembers making this deal. And I can tell you that it was the beginning of an amazing journey for my friend. When Shabnam was a guest on my Cross in the Desert blog talk radio, she shared how even before Khomeini came into Iran, missionaries would come to their home. Shabnam was not a believer in God at all. And she said, I don't even believe there is a God that exists. One of the missionaries showed a film to her called the Jesus film, which has been used all over the world to win millions and millions of people to Christ. She remembers a scene in the Jesus film of Jesus dying on the cross. And she told me how that somehow stayed with her, that somehow shook her from the inside. And in other words, how can this man be so loving and forgiving of those crucifying him? Why is he dying? Well, at that time, she didn't understand the depths of God's love. But as things progressed, and her Christian friends fasted and prayed for her, Shabnam began to see what they were saying. I remember her sharing with me on the program how she had dreams about Jesus, about a man on a white horse, and how her Christian friend would try to interpret that for her and tell her that God had a calling on her life. Thinking back to when she was spared from the rape and the torture, her friend reasoned with her, God is calling you. Well, Shabnam continued to resist and said, no, I don't believe in this God that you're talking about. But her Christian friends continued to fast and pray day and night. And finally one day, after she became Canadian, after she left Iran and came to Canada, one day everything changed for Shabnam. She became a Christian. That journey from Evin prison, that surviving of the Iranian Revolution, the experience that she suffered through, was a way of God molding and shaping and preparing her for the work that she continues to do today. And so indeed, Shabnam Story is not only a survivor of the revolution 35 years later, but she's also a dedicated mother, a dedicated wife, and a dedicated Christian speaking out for those that don't have a voice. She speaks out daily on Facebook through her blogs and also through her posts, exposing the atrocities of the Iranian regime. So I can say it is a pleasure to be a friend of this great Iranian human rights activist who is doing many, many things today to educate all of us about the things that are happening in Iran. I really appreciate people like Shabnam who seem to have a way with words and educate all of us about the deplorable way that Iranians have to live under this regime. I appreciate you taking time to share this time with me. If you want to learn more about what's going on in Iran, you can friend request my friend Shabnam, or you can come to my Facebook page, Randy L. Noble, and I have postings there of the happenings in Iran, also petitions for you to sign and you to become involved in. Also, I feature my books that I write. I've written a book called The Rose of Nowruz, Dreams of Hope and Freedom. It's based on my friends in Iran and their experiences they've shared with me. It's a book speaking out for their hope and freedom. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this edition of The Cross in the Desert. God bless you. I will see you again very soon.